Sossusvlei. Namibia is a country in the southwestern part of Africa. The country is unusually dry for this part of Africa. The driest part of Namibia is called the Namib Desert. This vast desert lies along the western side of the country. The entire coastline of Namibia is a desert. It extends roughly 150 kilometers inland from the coast. Undoubtedly, the most well-known place in this desert is Sossusvlei. Sossusvlei is famous for its really giant red dunes. Many visitors visiting Sossusvlei don't realize that this area that they drive into is really just a small part of a vast area of sand. This region of dunes is called the Namib Sand Sea. Sossusvlei sits almost right in the middle of the Namib Sand Sea. A big area of dunes is often called a sand sea or an erg. There are actually some larger dune fields in the world, but none in southern Africa. Namibia itself does have some other regions of dunes as well, but the Namib Sand Sea is by far the biggest in the country. The Namib Sand Sea is roughly 49,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of Switzerland or the US state of Maryland. There are many interesting topics that we could cover regarding the Sand Sea, but in this video, we're just going to talk about where the sand comes from. We can think of a sand sea as a sand system, where we've got inputs, processes like dunes forming and stuff, and outputs where sand is eventually blown out of the sand dune and goes somewhere else. Sand in a dry place is just loose stuff susceptible to be pushed around by the wind, and so there can be multiple sources of sand, and indeed there are, but there is one primary source of sand, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. There are three ideas about the origin of the sand that are pretty commonly discussed. The first is that the sand comes from the desert itself, either from where the dunes are, from erosion processes, or blown around within the desert itself. The second is that the sand blows in from the east, from the interior of the country. And the third is that there's some larger transport process that brings the sand in from further away. I'll discuss the first two briefly and then give a more detailed explanation of the third one, because that's where the majority of the sand comes from. The first idea, that the sand comes from within the desert, is pretty commonly expressed by tourists who don't know very much about the geology and the geography of the region. It seems to make sense. The main problem with that is that erosion of sand, the creation of sand out of rock, is a very slow process, and there's a very large amount of sand. Most erosion that takes place in the Namib is going to be water erosion, which is usually floods coming through the desert, and a lot of that sand will just end up being washed out to sea. There will be some contribution to the dunes, but it's going to be very small. The second idea, that the sand comes from the east of the Namib, is also true to a tiny extent. There is some erosion out of the escarpment mountains that are to the east of the desert, but this contributes very little sand in comparison to the total amount of sand in the dunes. There's also more to this idea. To the east of the escarpment lies the very vast Kalahari Sand Basin, which is a huge area of sand within southern Africa. To explain why that sand is not the main source of the Namib Sand Sea's sand is beyond what I'll cover in this video, because it's a fairly complicated idea and I'll need to explain a lot of weather ideas and so on. So we'll get on to the third idea, that sand is transported from far away. There's a lot of nuance to sand transport, and some of it I find fairly interesting, but I'm going to try to keep things fairly simple in this video. It's fairly important to realize that the sand sea is made of sand, not fine clay material. Finer material can be transported at higher altitude and can move virtually worldwide. But sand is big enough that sand transport systems are limited. Sand can't be blown long distances through the air like clay can. So we're limited to two main transport systems for sand. One is being washed down by rivers or moved by water in general, and the other is sand being blown by wind but over a landscape rather than at high altitude. In South Africa, there's a fairly large mountain range called the Drakensberg Mountains. Like any large mountain range, the Drakensberg is the origin of several rivers. The most important out of these, for us, is the Orange River, which flows from the Drakensberg all the way to the west coast. When the river leaves the Drakensberg Mountains, there's going to be very little sand in that water. The catchment has lots of vegetation, and so there's not a great deal of erosion taking place. But as the river flows westwards towards the coast, there's a lot of dry areas where there's high energy runoff, as well as wind that'll blow sand into the river. And so gradually the river is going to accumulate more and more sand. By the time the river reaches the sea, where it's on the border between Namibia and South Africa, it's pushing a huge amount of sand out into the ocean. Now, once the water reaches the sea, you might think it's really strange that the sand ends up in the dunes. In actual fact, most of the sand sinks to the bottom of the ocean. The amount of sand that ends up in the dunes is just a tiny fraction of the total amount of sand over millions of years that have been pushed out by this river. Along the west coast of southern Africa, the predominant wind is blowing from the southwest. This means that it'll push the waves northward along the coast. Through a process called longshore drift, sand keeps being transported by the action of this wind in the waves northward along the coast, and deposition occurs along a large stretch of beaches. From the mouth of this river, the Namib Sand Sea is some 100 kilometers away, and so there's a huge amount of sand being blown inwards along the coast. In its path is a fairly famous landmark in Namibia, the diamond town, ghost town of Kolmanskop, which is mostly covered by this sand. But from there, the sand carries on blowing northwards and into the dune field and starts to accumulate as part of the Namib Sand Sea. This is a process that's been happening for hundreds of thousands of years, potentially millions of years, and is still ongoing to this day. So if you're planning a visit to Sossusvlei, hopefully you can ponder about where the sand comes from. Having done just about 1,000 Sossusvlei trips in my life, I really did count them. Sossusvlei is a very special place to me, and I'll talk about a few other interesting things about Sossusvlei in future videos. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'd really appreciate a like, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please subscribe.